For our last short video for this week, I wanted to give a very brief overview of disability rights and advocacy, which also tie to the history of special education. There are three media things for you to view for this week, two very short clips on the history of special education law, special education development. Those are linked in the slides. And also, our major event for this week, our major task for this week is to watch the video Crip Camp. So to give you a big overview is that disability rights came about as part of civil rights. Brown versus the Board of Education was a civil rights law that also has been used in many of our disability laws. You can never separate disability rights, civil rights, advocacy, and special education. It's intertwined. It's something that will always be intertwined and something that is also always developing. I wanted to use media to make it a little bit more interesting and a little bit more of a creative way to look at the history of disability rights, advocacy, and special education. Take your time watching and enjoying and engaging with the Crip Camp documentary. I have to say, it's only been a year or so since I've watched it in its entirety. And I think it is a really delightful way to look at how our country has evolved and developed, how the culture has evolved and developed. And what you need to know about me is that this has happened over my lifetime. A lot of this happened, the documentary Disability Rights and Advocacy started in the late 60s, and I was born in 70, and I've literally grown and watched this go. I'm not going to give you a lot of timelines. I'm not going to give you a chapter to read on the history of special education, because I think this is a better way to take a look at where we've been. Not that where we've been is knowledge that you need to have as much as it is awareness of where we've been so that we know where we can go. I'll give you a warning. The Crip Camp documentary has a lot of very frank talk about having a disability. There are some scenes that talk about sexuality with a disability. So just a little bit of warning that it's maybe not something you'd want to watch in a group. It's very meaningful, I would say, on your own. And I think an enjoyable way to look at the upcoming disability rights and advocacy as it has grown. We, of course, get into, when you talk about disability rights and advocacy and how the movement grew from civil rights, we also need to address the issue of the cultural model of disability and intersectionality. And chapter 2 from our text this week really gets into the intersectionality and the disproportionality of having Black or brown skin and having a disability in the United States, especially in our schools. There are a lot of ways and things that are biased about the way that we label students that are culturally different and learn differently. And there are a lot of the ways that we are recognizing and growing. And again, it's not as simple to think that the civil rights movement gave way to the disability rights movement, gave way now again to the cultural rights movement. They're intertwined, but we're constantly looking at things through these different lenses. So I've given you a lot of resources this week to look at both of those things, the main parts being chapter 2 from our text and the Crip Camp documentary. Your discussion board assignment this week is based on the Crip Camp documentary. The reason we do this is because all of these things have a direct impact on the educational outcomes for our students. And when I say our students, I mean all of our students. Right now, in the United States, the biggest way we measure educational outcomes are whether or not a student graduates from 4 years from high school with a diploma, and that's earned in all sorts of different ways and under control by the individual 50 states. And we take a long, hard look at post-secondary employment outcomes, whether or not someone has a job and if they are paid well, underpaid, or not paid at all for their job. And I will tell you that the outcomes for students with disabilities that do not receive a disability or do not receive a diploma are not good. And we also know that students of color who also have a disability are less likely to receive that diploma. We also see the same type of trends in post-secondary employment. And these lead to not desirable life outcomes for people with disabilities and people who qualify as both being a person of color and a person who has a disability or a person from a different culture. Our chapter 2 does a much better job of explaining it than I would, but we are all working to become advocates in many different ways to make sure all students, no matter where they come from and no matter how they learn, have equal opportunity and equal access to success. Enjoy the different media ways this is presented this week and engage using your thoughts and let your brain kind of roll over those things. And then also engage with our discussion board before the end of the week this week.